And thank you everyone for tuning in and for Lisa and the folks at the San Lorenzo Valley Museum for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to speak with you all. Um, the talk I'm going to give today, uh, this one I started with Researchers Anonymous and kind of built a little from there. But I'm going to be looking at some of the archives and looking at archival documents and giving a little bit of an analysis of this and looking at how documents are used to tell stories. In this, I'm going to be looking at the question of whose stories are privileged and told, why we need to be critical of sources. And I'm going to be looking specifically at the indigenous community in Santa Cruz through the Mexican era into the American era. So looking at the kind of the second half of the 19th century. Now, archival documents that speak to this history are very difficult to find, right? Archives that speak specifically to the Native American history are very difficult to kind of parse through and be able to piece this together. So while it's difficult, especially when you start factoring in the historical biases that exist within these documents and within the makers of these archives themselves. So this talk is going to explore the challenges of working with archives from these eras. I'm going to ask questions about which archives and accounts we can give credence to or which ones we tend to, and then also look at which archives and accounts are considered to be authoritative on these histories and these stories, and how we go about understanding these histories, and especially with communities that have been underrepresented in the archives themselves. Native people didn't often have, very rarely had their own voices recorded historically. And so piecing together that history requires looking through other histories and kind of working to piece this together. As Lisa introduced, this is the cover of my book that came out, I guess, 3 years ago now. I'm working on other projects now, but my book basically looked at the history of Native people from the Santa Cruz area prior to the mission and up into about 1900. So throughout the whole of the 1800s and a little bit before. So spanning the what was the Spanish colonial era with the mission into the Mexican national era and then through to the American era. So I want to start by giving a little bit of an overview and kind of give a quick overview of who the people are of this area that we're talking about to kind of help make sense of this. Also want to talk a little bit to give you some context about the impact of Mission Santa Cruz so that we can kind of understand what was happening for the Native community by the time period that we're really going to focus in on. So Mission Santa Cruz was founded in 1791. At the point that they were founded here, it was founded on the homelands of a tribe called the Uipi people. You can see here on this map. I'm not sure if you see my arrows, but I'm kind of circling it here. The In what was the Santa Cruz area were a handful of different tribes, about 7 different tribes. They spoke a language that we understand today was called the Awaswas language. It was related to other Ohlone languages throughout the area. Throughout the whole Bay Area, there's about 7 or 8 different Ohlone languages that are spoken. The closest neighbor are the Mutsun language speakers, which is just over the hill in San Juan Bautista area and Gilroy around there. What you see in this map here is I put together a map in collaboration with Amamutsan tribal chairman Valentin Lopez, and it was his idea and his suggestion, but he asked if we could put a map together that showed specifically which tribes were taken to Mission Santa Cruz so we could see the impact of that specific mission here. And so that's what this map is here, and it's color coded to show like the number of people. So the darker these areas here, the more people were taken from these areas. In the direct vicinity of what is Santa Cruz County now. Again, where the Awaswas people, just over the hill where you see the Unahaima, the Ausaima, and the Tamoy. These are Mutsun speaking peoples over on this side they were taken later to the mission. And then from the Locobo over here, which is basically, that is Pacheco Pass area, and then over to the east of that is San Joaquin Valley, where the Yokuts people. Um, the impact of Mission Santa Cruz over between 1791 to about 1835, there's about 2,500 Native people who were taken to Mission Santa Cruz and baptized there from about 35 different tribes, if you can believe that, uh, throughout these regions that you see here marked in this. A lot of different village sites. By the close of the mission, which the mission was secularized and Native people were emancipated by 1839, by the close of the mission, so the mission had run about, almost 50 years, a little under 48 years. In that time period, I said 2,500 people were taken here and baptized in Mission Santa Cruz, and yet there was about 100 survivors by 1839. After a wave of smallpox came through in 1838, that took out some of the elders that had survived the mission era. So very few survivors of the mission um, in that period. So I think that's an important context, first of all, to understand. Um, this is a map that was actually based on the work of, I know some of you may know Edna Kimbrough, who was a local, had worked for state parks back in the 80s and 90s, and had been involved. And this is one of her maps where she was trying to map out where people went afterwards, and I kind of added some detail to it. But this map shows you what happened to the Native community after the close of the mission. So by 1839, after Mission Santa Cruz was closed, the survivors, like I said, there was about 100 of them, a little over. They ended up living in a couple different areas. The biggest areas you'll see at the top of the map here is this area that says the Potrero de la Huerta, which is the basically no, it became known as the Potrero in later years very quickly. But this is where the orchards were from the mission. This is down in the area that now, for those who know the area, you would see Costco and kind of that little industrial area behind the mission down there. That's the old orchard area that was where many of the surviving Native people ended up, especially the Yokuts people, who are the ones from San Joaquin Valley who would come in later. On the west side over here, which is marked and was called at least briefly the Rancheria de la Fuentes, which is the rancho of the fountains, or like which is where the springs are, right? Later, this becomes a rancho called Tres Ojos de Agua, which is the three eyes of water, which is the springs that are up on the west side there. So same reference there to the fountains. There were some families that lived up in this area. Some of them lived up where people know as Westlake Park. That was where a fellow named Geronimo and his wife Barbara, and they were local tribal members from the Zayante tribe, or at least Geronimo was. Barbara was from the Aptos tribe, and they ended up having community over on the west side there. And that includes, I list out some of the people here: Geronimo, Barbara, Cecilia, Canudo, David, and Rojas, Lorenzo, and others. Um, just a quick note on this before we go into the other stories. One of the, I think, more interesting archival documents that really does give some detail about Native people in this era, in the Mexican era in particular, is the land case for the Tres Ojos de Agua land trials. So in the early American era, there were a lot of kind of legal battles over trying to kind of justify and prove lands, from the rancho land grants. And so there's all sorts of these trial transcripts that are held up at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley. And in there, there's extensive files. I think it's like about 600 pages of interviews that were conducted to try to ascertain exact boundaries for the Tres Ojos de Agua. And in these interviews, many people were brought in, a lot of them of the California community, and they were able to they asked them all sorts of questions. Geronimo had passed away. He died in 1850. So these interviews were done in 1860. So it was about 10 years later. But there are many questions about Geronimo and his family and where exactly they lived. And there's all this great detail that come out of that. Those records are fascinating. What we learn is that Geronimo was very well known and well regarded in the larger community. A lot of people bought vegetables from him and Barbara and their kids, their family. Um, he had different homes. In the winter months, they lived above the bluffs, and in the summer months, they lived below them, which, fascinatingly enough, is kind of mirroring the way that Ohlone people tended to live along the coast, where they would move seasonally. So they continued that practice. There's little stories about him selling rock from the quarry on the west side to folks like Paul Sweets, which people might know who are local historians. So all sorts of really fascinating stories, even stories about them selling leeches to people from some of the waterways there, which is interesting. Anyway, a lot of great detail come out of that. So those are really rich things. One other thing I'll add there was a Frenchman who testified, Frey was his name, and he said that Geronimo had that this guy had moved into town. He was a Frenchman. He didn't have anything, and Geronimo saw that he really didn't have anything, so he had given him a plot of land to grow food on. And when he went to try to pay him back, he refused to take any payment for it and just said that he wanted to make sure that he had a place to be able to grow land. So the portrait that we get of Geronimo is from these testimonies is really fascinating and really quite a generous person and member of the community there. Um, so moving on a little bit from the Mexican era and thinking about this, I want to talk a little bit about Eliza Farnham. Some people might know, of course, Eliza Farnham is kind of a famous early feminist in the American era that lived in Santa Cruz here. Um, she actually received some of the lands on the west side behind the Potrero. This here is an old map, the Russell lands, a map of Farnham's lands here. You can see on the right there. And this map uh, shows kind of the chunk of lands that Farnham received. So Farnham, Eliza's husband, was a man named Thomas J. Farnham. He was a lawyer. He had been involved. He had done legal support for Isaac Graham. And for those who are familiar, the Graham affair, Isaac Graham ended up getting arrested with about 30 other Americans during kind of preceding up to the Bear Flag revolts, and they were causing problems up here. And Farnham ended up representing them and was able to get them a big settlement where they came back having received a lot of land. Um, Looks like I'm going to admit it when I guess I get notified when somebody enters the waiting room. Anyway, so Farnham received these lands, but he died before he could actually move there. And so his wife ended up moving into the area in 1849, and she lived there. Eliza lived there in the Potrero area for about 7 years, from 49 to 56. And this is a decennial there. Interestingly enough, on this, if you look at the bottom two houses here, I don't know if you can read that very well, but it says Casa de Pascual, the one on the left, and Casa de Fidel. Pascual and Fidel were two of the native Yokuts men who had received the lands here, and so they were kind of prominent men who lived from the mission era, and they end up being reflected on this map here. This is an 1866 Foreman and Wright map that shows the Potrero area. Um, so at this point, Farnham had left. Like I said, she left in 1856, but it gives a little bit of a sense of this area. You can see the Mission Orchard, which is where some of the Native people were still living at this point in 1866. There were other Native community members who were living up on the King Estate, which is kind of up here, which is eventually where Cron's Tannery gets built. This is River Street. Going back here, you can see the Evergreen Cemetery. So you can kind of see the beginnings here of the development of what would become the city of Santa Cruz. Just to give you a little bit of a visual of this all. Um, so yeah, so with Eliza Farnham, I want to give a little bit of quotes from her. So one of the sources that we get a sense of these things was from Eliza Farnham. She ends up writing kind of a memoir of her years in Santa Cruz. And so let me share a couple of her quotes here. Um, when she describes them, and this is, I'd say, is a good example of kind of some of the historical bias that comes through there, right? She says here, the Indians were already converted, right? Of course, they had gone through the mission to their hands. She's talking about the missionaries, from lawless enemies to useful and perfectly manageable servants. So a lot of this, of course, is reflecting kind of the attitudes towards Native peoples in the mid 1800s. Um, she describes some of her experiences with some of the people in the Potrero. She describes um, uh, the Potrero neighbor that she had hired to help. She said, "He always casts upon me when we meet the kindly patient glance of an abused benefactor." Um, and then she goes on to talk about his work there. Um, she had hired these, she continued that she had hired these folks for about $2 a day. And then she's describing somebody that she doesn't actually name, unfortunately. So we don't get a whole lot of detail about him. But she describes him, she says, a soft spoken, persuasive old fellow who, if left alone, would stand erect by the half hour watching the blackbirds, the clouds, the plows, the mission. Anything that he could make himself believe was worth his attention, and he would bestow it very cheaply. So it doesn't give us a whole lot of detail, unfortunately, about them, but it does give us a little bit of insight into kind of the attitudes towards Native people of the era. And again, a good example of some of the archives to work through. And then one last quote, it says, and this is when she had gone down to visit the Castro Adobe, and she says, in the corner at one end of the range, a dirty Indian girl was making tortillas, the bread of the country. So again, there you get a reflection of kind of the attitudes that she certainly had of the Native community members. I want to look at a little bit of the accounts from a woman named Sarah Hinton Gurley. She wrote her accounts in an account called My Early Childhood Memories. She lived in Santa Cruz, arrived in July of 1856, so the same year that Farnham left, so kind of coming in right at that end there. And she uh, lived in Santa Cruz for a good 20 something years, 25 years until 1879. And then she moved back in 1913. And these are recollections from her earlier years, right, her childhood years. And here she gives some of her tidbits there, right? She lived again in the same area, the Potrero area down there. She says there are a good many Indians of Santa Cruz at the time. They sat in the background and partook of the remnants of the repast. After the citizens had finished, something stronger than lemonade was freely indulged in on this day, and by night there was much evidence of its effects. And there's a lot of accounts of this. A lot of the American accounts about the Native community are talking about people who are drinking after work or getting into trouble. Um, and I would suggest that it's good to interpret this with an understanding that we have a little bit more these days of the role of alcoholism in kind of mitigating trauma. Again, you're talking about community members who had seen so much devastation and change, had seen so much of their community dying around them through hardships over the years. So I think when you look at it through that lens, it does kind of it helps us to understand why that might be possible and why people do turn to alcohol as a way to manage this kind of trauma. She goes on, the Indian settlement was in the Potrero on the left side of the street by that name near Evergreen Cemetery. It was fenced in by a deep ditch so that their horses could not escape. Most of the Indians' houses were made of wooden slabs with shake roofs. This is a great account. I really do find there's a lot of little tidbits in here, little clues to kind of help triangulate where people were and to understand some of these histories here. She talks about a sweat house that they had plastered with mud on the outside. A fire was built in the center of a small place for the smoke to escape. The Indians sat around the fire. When sufficiently sweated, they ran from the building and plunged into a hole of cold water in the creek. Which I think is fascinating, of course, too, that Native peoples are continuing their practice, right? Sweat lodges are used throughout North America by different Native peoples, certainly used around here. And so, again, we see these little signs of kind of cultural continuities and things that people would do well beyond the mission era. Another quote, she says, they made their living by working for the white people. They were expert pickers of wild blackberries and got many where the golf links are now. That's Pogonip, of course, right? And they were trustworthy and well behaved, except when they indulged in cognac. Then they quarreled among themselves. Again, more signs of this, right? And there's a lot that show up in newspapers and other things too. Um, She also talks some of her quotes. There's more. It's really a rich account. She got to know folks well, um, and she talks. She gives a couple stories. She talks about how the Indians used to pass on our house on the way to pick up wild blackberries. Amelia Hines, her friend, right, and her were young girls then, and they each had an Indian admirer. The one who brought her berries was Lahu. He called about dusk, Sala Benicia. I hurried out and he gave me the choicest berries he had picked. My mother thought it was hardly the right thing to take the berries, but she used them just the same. The berries were much larger, right? Um, and in these ones I'll show you now, you kind of get a little sense of the social stratification and the way that Indians were viewed and kind of this a little bit of a second class citizenship stuff going on here. Drinking liquor made the Indians very quarrelsome, and they fought with knives among themselves. And indeed, there is a story from the 1870s where there was a drunken fight where one man was killed. Um, Jesus Maria, I think his name was. And so she must be referring to this, right? So there's different ways that the historical accounts will verify some of these stories. Lahu was badly cut about the face in a fight. I told him I could not take berries from Indians that quarreled, so that put an end to her getting her free berries. Um, and then, oh, there we go. And then Amelia's father hired a young Indian named Jesus to work for him sometimes, and he smiled on Amelia. He got quite in earnest, and her brothers, for a joke, told him the proper thing to do would be to ask her father if he could marry Amelia. He took them at her word and asked her father. He explained it to the Indian and told him it would be a terrible thing to do for a white girl to marry an Indian. So that was an end to the Indian bows when we were young girls. So that last one, of course, is a sad story that really reflects this, yeah, this kind of racial gulf right between the Indians and the settler community. Yeah, it kind of gives you just it's kind of told as this fun story, but I think it gives a little bit of a sense of some of the tragic relationships and kind of limitations of what Native people were actually able to even do, right, and be considered as second class. But anyway, it's a rich account. If you haven't checked those are online. You can find those old accounts. Another area, and I'm just going to kind of go through a handful here, and then we'll talk about some other ways about looking at these documents. But I want to talk a little bit about Alphonse Pinard. Pinard was a French linguist who came through Santa Cruz in August of 1876, so a little bit after the other two accounts. And these are some of the ways that he described um, the area here. He went through I don't have to do it line by line here, but he went through the area that's known as the Potrero that we've been talking about here. And he was, in particular, he was searching for Native peoples to record language. He was one of about three linguists who came through in the 1870s. They were traveling throughout California and they were recording words and different elements of people's language. And so in the Bancroft are his actual diaries of when he passed through. I worked with some French translating students. My French doesn't really exist, but they were really helpful in translating this for me. And it's really fascinating the notes that he had there, in addition to the words that he was able to get. But these are some of the stories that he shared. So he said, again, he's talking about the Potrero. In groups of six or seven, they live in little wooden shacks, but I notice that among them you can see cleanliness that is seldom found among Indians as they are. This is a man who is kind of traveling around looking for native communities. He talks about this woman, Old Eulogia, who gets talked about quite a bit in some of these other documents. He says she's a woman about 50 years, originally from the Tulare, which is what they refer to as the San Joaquin Valley. The Spanish had called it the Tulare because of the tule reeds that come out of kind of the swampy areas of where San Joaquin Valley is. He goes on to describe her, says she has a flat face, a square nose, long nostrils, and of yellowish brown skin, fairer than that of Indians of this part of the coast. The others, three bucks, two women, and a criatura, which is means a little kid, right? Present a mixed type. So, there's interesting details here. You do get a little bit of the type of thinking that he had at the times there. He goes on another story here. He says, talks about old Mariano. And some folks who've worked with history, like Phil Reeder, have looked at a man named Mariano Hablitas, who worked at the Cooper with the Cooper brothers. So they're talking about him. He had just died a couple of years before that, the 1874, I believe. Um, and so he's trying to piece together some of the details that he can find about Mariano here. Um, and then a little more detail about Eulogia. Again, was born in the Tulares, but brought here very young age and does not remember her time in the Tulares. Um, he goes on, there's a lot of details in these things. He talks also about Justiniano Rojas, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here. And he was, of course, at the time they had really believed that he was 123 years old, which of course was not the case. But they saw him as, he becomes this very big figure here. Justiniano Rojas does. Um, and then he talks about this other guy, Santiago, who was from Mission Santa Clara, um, which I found quite a few details about him. But he goes on, Pinar goes on, he lives in it with his family on the other side of San Lorenzo in a small shack. It works at the tannery. But as soon as work is done, he's drunk. Now, he is actually one of the people who was involved with that knife fight that Hinton was talking about, Hinton Gurley. So there's ways that some of these stories start to triangulate the more details that we get about these um, too. And then he talks about this guy, Rustico. Now, Rustico, um, as it turns out, when I was able to piece together all these histories, his father was actually one of the men arrested for the assassination of Padre Quintana back in 1812. Rustico does appear to be a prominent member of this community. He's one of the people that Pinar interviews and gets a bunch of words from. And so here he gives him a little description: small, robust, square shoulders, big head, all in the shape, while in a shape of, I couldn't quite read what that word was, short and pushed inward, his face flat, with very pronounced cheekbones and flat lips, dark skin like chocolate. He was once singer of the mission, and he remembers his language well, which is, of course, why he goes on to interview him. So some of this you can kind of see the thinking of the time, right? The 1870s, a lot of the sciences of the times included things like phrenology and like the study of the shapes of people's heads, the idea that social science could understand phenotypes of people's faces. And so that's why a lot of the descriptive stuff, especially people who are working with Native people, they're subscribing to these kinds of racialized thinkings, and so you get a lot of this kind of description of people at the time. So all of these accounts, I think they're really valuable in their own ways. None of them really give a full three-dimensional view of Native people from the area, but taken in collective and putting these different stories together with the other accounts that we have, the newspaper accounts, and the mission records and whatnot. That's how I worked with my book to kind of piece together a lot of these stories and the details of things that were happening there. But because there's, as you see through all these examples I just gave, there's a tremendous amount of bias in these historical records, the perspectives back then. So then the question becomes, how do we better understand this history and work through these biases? Um, Oh, and one last note, he said that Rustico claims that old Justiniano was native of Gilroy Mission. Now, there was no mission in Gilroy. That's kind of an interesting little detail. But I will say that when I did do an extensive study on Rojas, I did find that he was from roughly around Gilroy, not too far away from there, from a village of Chuputak that was over there. So some of this information that trickles through, there's errors. There's no mission in Gilroy, but he wasn't wrong that he was from that area. He actually was able to identify. I want to talk a little bit about Rojas because I think he's maybe the best example that we have here in Santa Cruz, where we can see kind of the extent of these kind of projections and the ways that Native people were romanticized by the settling communities. And I mentioned him a little before when we introduced him with Pinards and others. But Rojas was in 1870. he came in. There was a couple photos taken of him. This is one taken in '73. At the time, some people looked. A newspaper reporter looked up his records, and they were trying to figure out how old he was. They found a different fellow by the name Justiniano Rojas. Often names were kind of reused after people died, and they saw this name in the baptismal registries, and they added it together, and they said that he was 125 years old. And that started this whole kind of fascination. There was portraits made of him. The story of Rojas circulated across the globe. There were stories in newspapers from Australia that talked about Rojas and how he was 100 and lived to be 125. It was used to kind of sell people on California. It's like, come out here, the beautiful waters, the clean waters. People live to be Indians live to be 120. So there's all these stories that kind of circulate at that because of really a mistake that they did in looking at these. This is the other photo that survived from the time. This one was taken in 1874 also, but at a different gallery downtown Santa Cruz. So the real story, and this is a cutting from a newspaper article about him here. And you can see some of the language that they use about this 122-year-old. The real story of Rojas, and there's a couple people have written about him, including historian Robert Jackson and local historian Jeff Dunn have both written articles about him. And I wrote an article more recently with a friend of mine, Boyd Cothran, and we were looking at this American fantasies about Native peoples and these the ways that these stories of ancient Indians were used to kind of promote the California, right, as boosterism to get people to move here, as California being an idyllic place. Although, I mean, you could argue California is a beautiful enough place. You don't have to lie to people and tell them that the Indians lived to be 130 years old to sell people on California. But nonetheless, that's what was happening there. The real story of Rojas was much more interesting, I would argue. He was a fellow named Irachis, was his name. And he, like I said, he was from roughly the Gilroy area. There was a village site over there. Him and his family were taken to Mission Santa Cruz when he was a young man, maybe 5 years old. And much of his family members died at the mission, but he stayed in the area. Anyway, fascinating story that I won't go into all detail. But this is, again, a great example of the ways that these biases existed. And here, this is again, some of the ways that his image was kind of sold. This is an illustration. Of course, I end up using this in the cover of my book. But this is an ad here or a page from the illustrations of Santa Cruz County. And again, he came from a little village site called Chapuktak, which is right here near San Juan Bautista, which is not too far from where Gilroy is today. And, of course, the romanticizing of kind of ancient Indians, as they're called, it was not just unique to Santa Cruz. It was happening other places too. Here's one from Santa Rosa area here, where we found this image is fascinating. It talks about Fernando, the last of the Sotoyome Indians, who was 129. Of course, he wasn't really. And then what was really interesting is on the next page, they have Fernando, his children and grandchildren. So of course he's the last of the Indians with his children and grandchildren. So again, and this speaks a little bit to these kind of at the time anthropological notions that people were only Native people if they were still practicing what their ancestors practiced, but becoming modern people, they ceased to become Indians, right? Some of these ideas about authenticity and stuff like this that are, very problematic, of course. And for people who are descended from Native people today, right there, they very much understand themselves to still be Native people, even if they aren't living in Tule homes. Okay, moving on a little bit from this, and I'll move through this quickly, but to continue. But just a quick introduction of Tahoe and Catch. Tahoe and Catch were two young men who were their parents had been at the mission. They were living in the Potrero area. And we won't get deep into their story, but it is interesting to see how they're written about. These two young men were both arrested for burning down a barnyard in 1884. They were sent to San Quentin, and they died shortly afterwards. But the stories that are told about them talk about their knowledge, expertise in local plants and animals, their ability to find, expert bird collectors who knew where all the nests were of the local birds. I go into much more detail if people are interested in the details about this. Is one of the later chapters of my book. But very fascinating story. They were both players on the local baseball team. In fact, he was the catcher, right? And Tahoe was the shortstop for the baseball team. But they worked in the community there, and yet they're referred to in these handful of newspaper articles that come out as these Indian firebugs, the sons of the forest, illiterate and drunken Indians. And of course, like everything else, their stories are much more interesting and complex. One account in the newspapers there from Mrs. Fagan, who one of the boys I think Tahoe worked for, she referred to him as being faithful and industrious, and had found them honest. So a lot of little details like that. Anyway, fascinating story. Again, don't have the time to get into this because I want to move on to a couple other quick things here. One of the problems, just thinking about the difficulties in trying to piece together these histories, I want to give an example that shows up in 1930 newspaper. And this is there was an interview in there from a guy named John Doyle, who lived in Watsonville. And he had been an enumerator, right? He was a census taker for the 1860 census. And so in this interview, there's a great quote for him, but he explains that he said, "Before I finished my account, he said, I received instructions that Indians were not taxed and should not be enumerated. Consequently, there were a great number of Indians I could not enumerate." So this is something that when I ran across this, and I think actually I first ran across this at the Kimbrough archives, and the Kimbrough had actually found this, and so it kind of helped point my way to it. But it helps account for it's I think a great example of the ways in which archival documents are problematic, right? There's an erasure of Native people back in those eras because for whatever reasons, right, they were not taxed, therefore they shouldn't be counted, right? And so as far as historical documents go, it can be difficult to find people in this, right? So this is exactly why it's very difficult to rely on some of these documents. As a counterpart to this, there is a very famous account from a man who survived Mission Santa Cruz, Lorenzo Asisara, where he gave three interviews in the 1870s, or one of them in 1890. And there was a professor at UCSC at the time, Ed Castillo, back in the 80s, and he's a native man himself. He's a member of the Coahia tribe down from LA. He would go up, moved around. He's retired now, but he ended up publishing these interviews of and these oral stories of Asisara, which are really important interviews. There's very few. There's only three or four first account from people who actually lived in the missions, native peoples, and so he gives this great account. And at the time, Ed Castillo, there were some public rebuttals of these oral histories, right? There were some people, famous historians at the time, who basically took exception and said that because it was an oral history, because he was remembering things and it wasn't an official document. So there is this debate within the field of history, by historians, about the value of oral histories versus kind of official governmental accounts. Very interesting thing within the field there. And I want to, the last story I'm going to share with you is about that, because I think that's a really interesting thing. As a historian myself coming into the field, this what I've always run into is that there's kind of a bias against trusting oral histories, because historians weigh what kinds of accounts, what kind of documents are trustable, right? What can you trust? But I want to give an example that, in my mind, pushes back on this idea, and maybe thinks that it argues that actually the oral histories might be better sources sometimes. and some examples. So I'm going to share with you. This is a from taken from a book by Elias Castillo called Cross of Thorns. In the foreword to this book, the foreword was written by Alma Wilson Chairman Valentin Lopez, who also wrote the foreword to my book too. But this is a story that he shares. In that book there, right? So he says, as a young boy, I listened to, this is Valentin Lopez speaking, I listened to stories from my elders about the cruelty of the missions. There were tales about how Native women were captured with their thumbs tied together with leather straps to form human chains and marched forcibly from their tribal lands to the missions. If the Indians did not cooperate, the soldiers at times killed them. In one incident, this is the one I want to highlight, more than 200 women and children of the Oristimba tribe living near what is now the town of Newman, were being taken to Mission San Batista. When after passing the summit of Oristimba Narrows, which is still out there, I said these women refused to go any further. The Spanish commander ordered the women and children killed with sabers and their remains scattered. So this is a story that existed within the Amamutse community that was told and shared within these families. And he had shared this quite a few times. There was a point where there were some people who didn't like this story going out there because there wasn't at the time any historical data to back this up. And in fact, I had a conversation with a very well-known, prominent California historian who asked me what I thought about this story. And he made it clear to me that he felt that this was irresponsible because there was no documentation. And I asked him, I said, well, where do you think this story came from? Do you think that they made it up? Or do you think it's something that circulated within their community? And he didn't really have an answer for that. He just thought that it was doing damage by being repeated. Well, the good thing is more stuff has come to light, right? So at some point I was doing research and I ran across the work of Frank Latta. And I'll just share briefly about Frank Latta. Some people might know about him. If you're unfamiliar, Latta was an oral historian, ethnographer of the Yokuts people. He lived out in San Joaquin Valley. He was raised in Stanislaus County near Oristimba Creek, which is near what we were talking about. He grew up working on ranches, became very interested in the stories that he had heard from early pioneers out there. So he began interviewing people and gathering research in 1906. He worked as a teacher, teaching drafting and carpentry at high schools in Gustine, Porterville, Shafter, and Bakersfield from 1915 to 45, and he published numerous articles in the San Joaquin Valley newspapers in the 20s and 30s. At one point, he interviewed a man, Thomas Jefferson Mayfield, who was a white man who had grown up in a Yokuts village. And following after his mother had died, right, he was adopted by the Yokuts. And he was on his deathbed. Latta sat down with him and ended up writing down his account, published it as this book here, Adopted by Indians, which is out there and available, and a fascinating read of this person who was raised in this Yokuts community. He also wrote this other book on the right, the Book of Yokuts Indians, which is out of print, tough to find, but I was able to find a copy of it. One last note about Latta is he actually moved to Santa Cruz in 1956. His sons, his grandchildren are still in town here. I think there's even a Latta jewelry store from his grandson, I believe, down in Capitola. But his family lived in the area, kind of well known in the area. Anyway, fascinating human being who'd done some great work. He published this book, Handbook of Yokuts Indians, in 1949. I'd been looking for it for a long time. I ran across it some 10, 12 years ago at a used bookstore. And in it, I found this very interesting story. So this is a story that was told to Frank Latta by Jose Antonio Aguila, whose grandfather was a soldier, a Spanish soldier in the early 1800s. And this is the story that he told. He said, my grandfather, Antonio Aguila, was with the Spanish cavalry when they made the agreement with the Indians to meet the next year, and he was with them when they came back. The Indians again refused to go to the mission. Apparently, they had refused it the first time. The cavalry tried to take them and got into a hot fight and killed or ran away all the older people. They took the younger ones to Mission Santa Clara. You know, the Spanish treated the Indians just like they did wild horses, shot the old ones and broke the young ones. This is from an account of the grandson of a Spanish soldier, right? So this is what he learned from his grandfather. He said that was the bloodiest battle the Spanish cavalry ever had with the San Joaquin Indians. They didn't intend to kill so many, but the Indians wouldn't quit or run away and hide. And so that's how it turned out. he goes on, he says, when the thing was over, the priests swore all of the soldiers to secrecy. So let me stop and pause for a second just to point out that if you think back to the story that Lopez told, right, this is Oristimba, there's this resonance there, right? The same thing. They had refused to go to the mission, and so they ended up killing him, right? So then he goes on, when the thing was over, the priests swore all of the soldiers to secrecy. I heard my father tell about it once. We were working cattle with two Indians, vaqueros, who had been captured as boys in that same fight. I knew them for many years afterwards and heard them tell about it several times. One noon, when we were eating our lunch under an oak tree, they told us that the fight had taken place nearby on the Oristimba Creek, just about a mile above the upper end of the Narrows and on the south side of the creek. They said that about 200 Indians were killed or scattered. As we rode away from our noon camp, my father told me he had told the truth, that all the soldiers had been sworn to secrecy about the fight, but his father was ashamed of his part in it and thought that I should know the truth about it. So what's fascinating about this, right, is a lot of things. There's a lot of things to break down in this. I think first of all, when it comes to my point with this is that when it comes to like the official documentations of reports, there's a reason why this wasn't reported and in those reports, right? And this is why that some historians had a problem with it and said, well, this wasn't official, right? But then you get this oral history and it explains exactly why. He says that the soldiers were sworn to secrecy, that they were not going to report this, and so there's no talk about it. But it percolates and it exists because of the shame that the soldier experienced, and that he told his son, who then told his grandson, who then happens to tell Frank Latta, right? So Latta went on and he searched for more documents on to support this. He did find a letter from Padre Jose Vieira from October 1810, and Vieira mentions in this letter, he said, we reached the spot where we had had the fight with some natives, and he's talking about when they were traveling through a similar area. Um, and then he also later in the letter describes a dry creek named Oristimac, where there's also tall pine and soil, and the same as the spot described where we had the fight. So there's these little hints of this that come out in these other letters, but for the most part, these things were not preserved. They're not shared, and they fail to get reported. But you can see from this story here exactly the process of how that happens. And so, my point again in all this is to point out that we have to be careful when looking at historical documents. We have to be careful of historical biases that exist there, and sometimes the oral histories that speak to difficult times can actually give us much more reliable information because it's born out of real experiences by communities who have endured them, and so we can use those to help understand these histories a little bit better. And sometimes it can even reflect things more accurately than the official documents can. And I'll go ahead and end on that note, but I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have.